I'm Dr. Peter Hammond, South African missionary, born and raised in Africa. 49 years, Director of Frontline Fellowship, Chairman of the Reformation Society. I've worked as far afield as Nigeria, the Congo, Sudan, Zimbabwe, all over Africa.
We are in a very special place at a special time. Why would you agree?
500-year anniversaries only come around once every half a millennium. This is just extraordinary that in our lifetime we've got the privilege of being at this epicenter of the Reformation, and the legacy of John Calvin's been just so important to us in Africa. The legacy of liberty, of freedom, of prosperity, the highest standards of freedom and of productivity and of prosperity have come from the teachings of John Calvin. All the great freedoms that we have, from separation of powers, the rule of law, the whole principles of lex rex, the law is king, that has brought about the greatest freedoms and the greatest prosperity in the world, came from the Reformation. So we in Africa are greatly indebted to the tremendous Reformation movement. In fact, the missionary movement that brought Africa the gospel was born out of those Reformed churches that had taken most seriously the teachings of the Reformation. I can mention the greatest missionaries of all time, the father of modern missions, William Carey, a Calvinist. The greatest friend Africa's ever had, David Livingstone, a Calvinist. The missionaries who brought the gospel to Africa, whether we're talking about Mary Slessor in Nigeria, the mother of the people, the one who rescued the twins from being sacrificed and killed at birth because they believed twins were bewitched. Mary Slessor came from the Presbyterian Church of Scotland. She wanted to follow in the footsteps of Livingstone, and she brought life to thousands, ended the slave trade in Calabar, and ended cannibalism and all kinds of heinous things. And what Mary Slessor did for Nigeria, what David Livingstone did in southern and central Africa, what C.T. Studd did in the Congo, and so many great missionaries in Africa, they grew out of the Reformation tradition. In fact, the 19th century missionary movement was overwhelmingly a Calvinist operation. It was the Reformed traditions, the Reformed churches that sent out the missionaries that won Africa to Christ.
No tradition is perfect. What mistakes have Reformed people made in missions or in culture as we look back in the past?
Of course there have been mistakes. In fact, when you're a pioneer, you've got no one to learn from. You're the one who's got to stub your toes, bump your head, burn your fingers, make the mistakes. But you know, while we can sit from the comfort of an armchair and we can criticize the missionaries and the pioneers of Africa, I must say I'm overwhelmed by all the great things they accomplished. And we think of, for example, Andrew Murray. There the British took the Cape Colony. It used to be Dutch. We need to remember that Holland was once a colony of Spain, and they won their freedoms because of William the Silent and the great Reformation teachings that freed Holland from Spain. And in Holland planted a colony with the gospel at the foot of Africa. And Jan van Riebeeck, our first governor, knelt in the sand of Table Bay and prayed that this colony would be for the glory of God and for the spreading of the Reformed faith throughout the continent of Africa. And in fact, that is what happened. Now that when the British took the Cape during the Napoleonic Wars, because Holland had fallen to the French, so they couldn't let France keep the Cape, and the British started an aggressive Anglicanization policy. They wanted to make sure that the people in the Cape spoke English. So what they did was they forbade the Dutch to bring in any more ministers from Holland. They said, you've got to get your ministers of the gospel from the British Isles. And immediately the Dutch said, but we're not Arminian, we can't have Methodist or Anglican priests. They said, you can get them from Scotland, they're Presbyterian. What the British had hoped was that the Scottish would preach in English, and this would force the Dutch settlers to Anglicize and to adopt Anglican worship and teaching. What they didn't know was that the Scottish missionaries who came over learned Dutch. And the Murray family, Andrew Murray has got to be the most famous South African minister. He's written more books in more languages translated than any other South African ever. And most South Africans would be surprised to know he wasn't South African, he's actually Scottish, because he's so assimilated to the culture. And
I need to ask you a few more questions.
We're celebrating now the 500th anniversary of the Reformation here in Geneva. Next year we'll be celebrating the 150th anniversary of the 1860 revival, which God blessed the Scottish missionaries amongst the Dutch and the Cape. And in 1860, revival burst out amongst these Scottish ministers preaching to the Dutch in Dutch. And by God's grace, we had revival that sent out thousands of missionaries throughout Africa, and I've seen their graves up as far as Nigeria.
Are there Africans who are deeply Calvinistic today as a result of the work who are actually native Africans and not, let's say, Caucasian missionaries?
Oh yes. The Reformation faith is deeply loved throughout Africa. I've found Calvinist churches, denominations in Nigeria, in Uganda, in Malawi, up in Sudan, people who are suffering severe persecution, churches that are being bombed by the National Islamic Front government in Sudan, churches that are being burned and attacked by Muslim mobs in Nigeria, churches that have endured severe persecution in the Congo and in Uganda, are deeply reformed, love the Reformed faith. And when we go in with Reformation books and Reformation films and presentation teaching, the people lap it up. They are tired of the dispensational, superficial, entertainment-orientated religious circus that is offered by so much of the dispensational, sinner-friendly type churches. They want to get back to the meat of the word. And so while the Reformed Church are not the majority in Africa, they are a significant, growing, deeply committed church. And so for us as a Reformed mission, we just are delighted and excited to be part of what God's doing in Africa, bring about a new biblical reformation and a spiritual revival in the 21st century.
What legacy do you want to leave for future generations as an African leader for the Christian gospel?
Back to the Bible for Reformation revival.
Any final thoughts you want to share?
Africa's got a tremendous debt to the people of Europe. Europe brought us the gospel. And when we come back to Europe, we are horrified and shocked to see the secularism and the liberalism and the apathy to spiritual things in so many of these countries that were once hotbeds of reformation and where the missionaries came from. And so I've been challenging many Africans that we have a debt to Europe. We need to send missionaries to Europe. We need to have African missionaries going back into Europe to bring the gospel, to remind the people of that great gospel that their forefathers and their ancestors brought to us. And perhaps this is God's way. The gospel has gone from Europe to America and to Africa, and we need to bring it back to Europe.
Amen. Thank you. Passionate, powerful, and delightful. Thank you.